August 21st, 1973. A Tuesday that began like most late summers in Riverside, California, golden light, heat lingering in the pavement, the kind of day that makes the edges of things look softer, like memory itself. The temperature climbed into the low 90s. Kids were counting down the final days before school. On television, headlines still churned with Watergate. The war that had defined a generation had recently ended, leaving a country unsettled and restless. And in the middle of all of that, a 23-year-old dreamer named Bret Michael Lewick stepped into the evening and disappeared. For more than 50 years, his name sat in a gray cabinet in the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Open, unsolved, a file with faded photographs, typewritten reports, and the steady ache of unanswered questions. The trail went cold in 1973, and for decades, the case was a quiet ghost in a small community. But when you lift the corners of forgotten files, when you dust away what time has covered, sometimes new light falls into old cracks. This is the story of Bret Lewick, the kid with a Phoenix logo painted on his car door, the young designer who wanted to build a brand, the man who vanished between 6:30 and midnight on an ordinary August evening, and the slow, stubborn work of trying to find the truth. Bret was, by every account, magnetic. People who knew him then, neighbors, friends, the seamstresses who pressed his jackets used the same word, magnetic. He had energy, an insistence that he belonged at the center of things. Born in 1950 in a modest house on Magnolia Avenue, he was the youngest child of Donald Lewick, who worked in the citrus packing plant, and Patricia, who stitched garments on a Singer sewing machine and taught her children the value of careful work. Bret grew up drawing sketching shoes, jackets, logos. Even as a teenager, he spoke differently about his future. Where others talked about steady jobs, Bret talked about identity, about branding, about how a symbol could carry a generation. He graduated from Riverside Polytechnic High School in 1968 with an A+ on his senior project, a full brand identity for a fictional sportswear line. A teacher wrote in red ink, "Professional quality. You have a future in this." Bret took those words seriously. College was an interlude. He enrolled at University of California, Los Angeles, lasted a semester, and left. He had a garage apartment and bigger plans than lectures could offer. By the age of 21, he'd saved $3,000 from odd jobs, warehouse shifts, graphic design, freelancing, selling hand-painted t-shirts at Venice Beach, and those bills became seed capital for something he called Project Phoenix. The logo he designed was ahead of its time. A phoenix rising, bold orange against black, with the tagline, "Rise Again" beneath it. He made 25 jackets, each carefully crafted, each stitched by local seamstresses who admired his attention to detail. He convinced 3 boutiques in Los Angeles to take his pieces on consignment. Then, the small orders sold out in 2 weeks. Orders began to come in. Boutiques called for more. Bret reinvested, placing an order for 100 more jackets, hiring 2 employees. At 23, he tasted possibility. He believed he could make his name appear on buildings someday. He believed in his brand. And somewhere on the horizon of that bright promise, something or someone waited to pull the rug away. August 21st, 1973. The last day anyone saw Bret alive. His appointment book, found later on his desk, listed 3 meetings. Investigators would confirm he kept the first 2. At 10 a.m., he met with Leonard Sutter at a Market Street coffee shop. Sutter, was a small-time businessman interested in investing. He said the meeting went well. At 2 p.m., Bret met a fabric supplier in Los Angeles and placed a large order. That supplier remembered him, a young man, eager, animated, talking about expansion. Bret returned to Riverside around 5 p.m. A neighbor, Dolores Ashton, saw him pull up in his baby blue 1969 Volkswagen Beetle, Bret's Phoenix logo painted on the door. He carried a box that Dolores assumed was papers. At 6:15 he called his sister Margaret. He told her he had one more meeting that night with someone who had serious money. He sounded excited and nervous. "I'll tell you everything tomorrow," he said. "This could be it, Marge. This could be everything." He left his apartment around 6:45 p.m. Another neighbor saw him drive east on Magnolia Avenue. That was the last confirmed sighting of Bret. After that, for the people who loved him, the world tilted. His sister went to his apartment the next day when he missed a scheduled meeting. The door was unlocked odd, because Bret always locked his door. Inside, everything was normal and too neat. Bed made, sketches on the desk, his appointment book in place. No signs of struggle. When police were called, the initial approach was straightforward. A young adult could have left. Perhaps he decided to go on the road, to follow an opportunity. But Margaret knew better. Bret wouldn't simply walk away. He'd been on the cusp of something real. Something wrong had happened. 3 days later, a ranch hand named Miguel Herrera climbed down into a shallow ravine on Box Springs Mountain, about 12 miles from downtown Riverside. There, partially hidden by brush, lay Bret's Volkswagen, nose down, driver's side door open. The car was scratched and dented, consistent with rolling down an embankment, but there was no blood, no sign of injury. Bret's wallet sat on the passenger seat with $43 in cash. His driver's license, business cards, nothing missing. The keys were in the ignition, turned off. At first glance, investigators considered accident or abandonment. But as they examined the scene, the sense of accident faded. The car's position suggested staged concealment. Behind the driver's seat, they found a leather briefcase. Inside, contracts, sketches, projections for Lewick Global Industries, and a yellow legal pad with a note at the top. Meeting Aug 21, 7:30. The notes were brief, crystalline. Interested in full acquisition, $50K offer. Wants proprietary rights to all designs. Concerned about competition. And underneath, triple underlined, too good to be true? $50,000 in 1973 was a fortune. For a 23-year-old with a garage operation, it was transformational. Bret's notation questioning whether it was too good to be true was the last glimpse into a mind trying to measure risk against possibility. Who had offered this sum? Who had drafted that meeting? Why would a man with designs but little cash be lured to an evening appointment without telling his sister where he was going? The police canvassed the area. They searched the mountain. They brought dogs. They interrogated friends and acquaintances. They found no body, no weapon, no definitive footprints beyond the obvious. Bret had vanished. In any disappearance, investigations fan outward from relationships and business dealings, from what is public to the private places people hide in. For Bret, 3 categories emerged: personal connections, business rivals, and the mysterious investor who had dangled a buyout. On the personal front, Bret had been dating Sandra Moreno for 6 months. They'd spoken of marriage. Friends remembered small tensions, arguments about Bret's obsession with the company. Sandra admitted they had fought the morning he disappeared. She said she had told him he cared more about his work than about her. She was at her parents' home in San Bernardino that night, an alibi confirmed. Police cleared her. There was also Eric Strand, briefly a partner in Lewick Global. Strand invested $1,000 for a 20% stake, then was bought out for $1,200 in July after a bitter falling out. Strand told anyone who would listen that Bret had cheated him. He had motive in the loose sense of resentment, and some acquaintances remembered him making dark comments. But motive without evidence is a rumor wearing the clothes of suspicion. Strand had no verifiable alibi and no physical link to the disappearance. The apparel world of Southern California in the early 70s was competitive. Larger companies kept an eye on emerging talent. Bret's designs could have been seen as theft-worthy, but in 1973, a small startup didn't usually attract lethal attention. That left the investor the person who offered to buy Bret's company for $50,000. Investigators checked phone records and found calls placed from a downtown Los Angeles payphone in the days leading up to the disappearance. In 1973, tracing was limited. The calls went nowhere definitive. The meeting had been scheduled for 7:30 p.m. on August 21st. Bret penciled it into his pad. He left his apartment at 6:45, never returned. Months passed. Weeks turned into years. The police shifted priorities. Cases with bodies and immediate leads took precedence. By 1975, the inquiry had slowed to a low hum. Bret was declared legally dead in 1980. His company was never what it might have been. His designs, some stored in a briefcase, others lost, became relics of a life interrupted. Decades rolled on. For Margaret Lewick, the days measured out in a slow, relentless question. Where is my brother? She did not stop looking, though the world is designed to let us forget, and she began to age with the uncertainty heavy in her chest. The case resided in archival boxes and a department file folder paper that breathed with dust, but the DNA of the mystery remained. Then, in 2013, during a digitization project, a cold case detective named Sarah Chen flipped through those boxes and stopped. The Lewick file was there, a tangle of physical evidence that had never been fully tested by modern forensic tools. In a new age of DNA databases and fingerprint systems capable of cross-referencing millions of prints, things that once sat mute could sing. She started with what was left in the Volkswagen and on the leather briefcase. Advances in fingerprint technology and fiber analysis allowed Detective Chen's team to pull partial prints and fiber samples that had never been processed. The prints were run through the FBI's IAFIS database. In 2014, there was a hit. A man named Raymond Colfax. Colfax, 78 now and living in Scottsdale, Arizona, was 28 in 1973 and worked as a business consultant in Southern California. He had a criminal record for fraud and embezzlement from a later unrelated case. When officers brought him in for questioning about prints found in Bret's car, he admitted to meeting Bret on August 21, 1973. He claimed it was at a diner in Riverside and that the meeting lasted about 90 minutes, ending around 9. He said he represented a client considering an acquisition and that the meeting concluded cordially. He acknowledged being in the vehicle, which explained the fingerprints on the briefcase, and he denied any involvement in Bret's disappearance. But what Detective Chen found in Colfax's records raised a red flag. In late August 1973, Colfax deposited $25,000 into his personal account. Records labeled the source as a consulting fee. $25,000 in 1973 is roughly equivalent to $170,000 today, an extraordinary amount for a small-time consultant. Colfax maintained it was the result of a legitimate deal that had nothing to do with the Lewick matter, but he could not provide comprehensive documentation. The company he said he represented, Westbridge Investments, was little more than a shell entity, dissolved by 1976. Westbridge existed on paper, not in practice. The bridge between a shadowy corporation and a sudden cash deposit is a long and dangerous one. It invites questions. Who benefited? Who paid? Who wanted Bret removed from the path of his own success? Colfax's story seemed convenient. Then, an even more human piece of evidence arrived. In 2016, Judith Colfax, Raymond's ex-wife, came forward. She had kept a secret for more than 3 decades. She remembered her then-husband coming home late one August night in 1973, covered in dirt, acting paranoid. She watched him burn his clothes in the backyard. He later used newly available funds to buy a car, take a vacation. Judith said she had been scared then. She carried those memories quietly for years. When the cold case was reopened and fingerprints linked Raymond's prints to Bret's briefcase, she felt compelled to talk. Her recollection was not a forensic match, but it was the human detail that colors a theory. People who commit acts of violence often leave behind collateral marks, changes in habits, sudden purchases, burned clothing, or the compulsive need to spend or hide. Judith's story matched behavioral patterns that can accompany guilt or complicity. Detective Chen assembled these pieces into a theory that felt, to her, like a portrait emerging from a fog. She believed Colfax arranged the meeting with Bret, used the allure of a buyout to entice him, then lured him to a remote location, Box Springs Mountain, where Bret met his end. The vehicle was staged to suggest accident or abandonment, while Bret's body was disposed of elsewhere. Colfax may have been paid to remove a rising competitor or to secure property and designs. The money deposited after the disappearance suggested a payout. Westbridge Investments, the shell, could serve as a convenient paymaster. It is a tidy theory, but theories in criminal investigations require evidence to become accusations. The work between hypothesis and indictment is a meticulous counting of facts, not the shortest path from suspicion to conviction. Colfax admitted being in the car at some point and meeting Bret that night, but his account could not be disproved to the criminal standard. There was no body, no murder weapon, no witness who saw the alleged act, no conclusive physical trace directly linking him to a homicide. The district attorney reviewed the material in 2017 and concluded it was insufficient for prosecution. The prints placed Colfax in contact with Bret. The funds were suggestive. Judith's memories were compelling, but not enough to meet the threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. When prosecutors decline to bring charges, it is not a declaration of innocence. It is a recognition of the limits of what can be shown in court. For the family, for Margaret in particular, that decision is a prolonged loss. We were so close, she would say, close to answers, close to a chance at closure. And then those doors remained closed. Even without charges, the new investigation pulled threads that had once been tangled and made them visible. It also raised new questions. If Colfax acted on someone else's behalf, who was that someone? Was there a corporation that wanted Bret's designs? Was it organized crime, a jealous competitor, or a private individual with the means to hire a cleaner and a cover-up? The shell company, the sudden deposit, the burning of clothes, these are the kinds of circumstantial facts that build a picture but rarely, by themselves, complete it. Between 1973 and 2014, the world changed. What couldn't be found with a flashlight in a ravine decades ago can sometimes be uncovered with patient inquiry and forensic advances. Detective Chen interviewed people who had once been young and reckless and were now old and measured. She placed photographs on a table and watched faces change. Memories shimmer with age. They shift under the weight of time. But sometimes, as Judith Colfax discovered, time clarifies instead of obscures, allowing a conscience to press and pressure to give in. In 2014, investigators found that Colfax's fingerprints matched partial prints on Bret's briefcase. They verified his presence with his own admission. They mapped financial movements. They found a man who had, years later, been convicted of financial crimes, someone with a capacity for manipulation at the least. And they listened to a woman who had glimpsed the aftermath through a window. They pieced together a narrative that looked, on a table strewn with documents, like a plausible chain of events. Yet the law hinges on firm links. Without a body, without a smoking gun, what could one prove? You cannot try a man for murder based on motive and suspicion alone. The prosecutorial threshold remained out of reach. What happened to Bret that night remains, at its core, an absence. His body has never been recovered. The places where people disappear can be vast and indifferent ravines, scrublands, abandoned fields where the earth keeps secrets well. Investigators revisit those places, bring new dogs, comb with metal detectors, analyze soil samples, but time can bury not only bodies, but the traces that point to them. The absence itself becomes evidence of the difficulty. If someone wanted Bret gone and intended to hide him, they had time and planning, perhaps friends to help, perhaps a single cunning man who knew the terrain. In 2018, Margaret made a choice that reframed the way Bret might be remembered. She donated his remaining designs and documents to the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in Los Angeles. There, pressed under glass and preserved in a climate-controlled archive, the hand-drawn sketches and the Phoenix logo took on the dignity of an unfinished life. They exist as artifacts of a young creative mind. They remind us that Bret was not only a missing person, not merely a case number, but an artist, an entrepreneur, a brother. Often in cold cases we find small compensations. Not justice, perhaps, but memory. The designs sit in a collection. Some exhibitions featuring the early lineage of American streetwear and brand innovation. Students study the sketches and see what might have been. Margaret walks the exhibit on certain days, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend, and places her fingers over a line drawn in ink decades ago. He had vision, she says. He had talent. Maybe somehow, somewhere, what he started kept going. Speculation attaches itself to the case like ivy to an old wall. Online forums host theories that stretch from the plausible to the conspiratorial, suggestions that Bret's designs were secretly absorbed by major brands, whispers that organized crime played a role, ideas that he staged his own disappearance. People interpret the absence to match their own hunger for meaning. Amateur investigators unspool timelines and overlay phone records and map sightings. None have produced a smoking gun. In small communities, where rumor can be another kind of justice, these theories keep a case from fading into total silence. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department lists the case as open and active. Tips arrive intermittently. Some are sincere, some are misdirected, some are cruel. Even decades later, new information can matter. The department continues to accept leads, to revisit old evidence when technology advances, to ask for help from citizens who may have seen something, remembered something, or kept a secret too long. There are moments in this case that cut like a compass through the fog. The notepad with "too good to be true" scribbled at the top, Bret's hand hovering over the idea of selling his dream. The partially burned clothing Judith remembers in a backyard in 1973, the deposit of $25,000 into Colfax's account after Bret vanished. Each detail is a syllable in a slow-to-form sentence. Someone took Bret away. But who, and why, and where? Those questions remain incomplete. For Margaret, the past has a relentless quality. She has lived with it for half a century. Her grief is not only for the brother who left, but also for the years stolen from him. The projects unrealized, the family milestones missed, the life that never had the chance to age. Bret would have been remarkable, she says in a voice that carries equal parts love and fatigue. He would have built something. He would have mattered in ways I can only guess. Detective Chen, who reopened and re-examined this human tangle, reflects on the nature of cold cases. Justice isn't always swift, she says quietly. It isn't always linear. Sometimes it's delayed, sometimes incomplete. But the work matters because there are people who waited, families who deserve to know, who deserve to bury their dead and move on with some steadiness. Even if we never find a body, if we can make the truth clearer, if we can remove the fog from a life that counts for something. There is a small public ceremony in 2019, organized by friends and sympathetic community members, where Bret's name is read aloud. Photographs are arranged on a table. A jacket bearing his Phoenix logo hangs like a pennant. People speak about what they remember. His laugh, a particular way he smoothed fabric with his hands, the intensity with which he sketched lines that one day might have become seams. Margaret stands with those who have not stopped believing and listens as the names of those missing are spoken into the air like offerings. There are no cinematic resolutions in most cold cases. The reveal is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is administrative, a memo declining prosecution, paperwork marking a case downgraded. Sometimes it is a resignation softened by humility. We did all we could with what we had. Those decisions are made in conference rooms and at prosecutors' desks, far from the ravines where small blue cars were found. For the family, they are felt like the slow closing of doors one by one, and yet the case continues to have life precisely because people refuse to let it die. Margaret visits archives. Detectives revisit old interviews. Students of design study the Phoenix sketches. The internet remembers more than some police departments. Threads are started. Crowds attempt to crowdsource a truth. Each new ear that listens can turn rumor into lead, or memory into testimony. The passage of time sometimes encourages silence, but it can also compel revelations as guilt, regret, and conscience shift. If you imagine Bret as a bright ember, his life offered a burst of heat and light that warmed those near him and then flickered. In many ways, the story is less about the final act and more about the life that preceded it, the ambition, the late-night sketching, the drive to make identity through cloth. It is about the fragile possibility of a small idea growing into something bigger. It is about how suddenly that possibility can be challenged by forces we cannot immediately name. What remains clear across 50 years is this. Someone met Bret on the evening of August 21, 1973. Someone discussed money and rights and proprietorship. Someone left with at least part of Bret's world repurposed into cash. And Bret, bright, driven, secretive about his work, stepped into the dark and never returned. We do not know whether the person who met Bret that night was an opportunist crook, a representative of corporate interest, an enforcer for someone else's greed. or a lonely man turned violent. We know the prince in the briefcase belonged to Raymond Colfax. We know a large deposit followed the disappearance. We know an ex-wife watched clothes burn. We know a sister kept faith and never stopped asking questions. We know that modern forensic work revived a case that was presumed cold, and that what it found was suggestive, persuasive to the imaginative mind, yet insufficient for a court of law. There are threads of hope. Technology improves. Databases expand. People come forward when they can no longer hold a secret. Evidence thought useless is sometimes reinterpreted through new science. And for the Lewick family, any small advance is a promise, an admission that the past is not sealed, that history can be revisited and revised with patience and rigor. If you have a face to the memory of Bret, let it be the one that belonged to a young man who drew late into the night and believed in a phoenix rising again. Let it be the image of a sister who would not accept absence as final. Let it be the image of an investigator who came to the case decades later and listened to a woman who saw a husband burn clothes in a backyard and decided that memory mattered. And if you have any information, no matter how inconsequential it may seem, about the disappearance of Bret Michael Lewick on August 21, 1973, call the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Tips have solved cases before thought unsolvable. A single recollection, a name, a place, a transaction, can turn a suspicion into direction. Bret Michael Lewick, 23. Last seen on a late summer evening, stepping toward a meeting with promises that shimmered like mirages. His body has never been found. His story lives in a file, in sketches, in the memory of those who loved him, and in the slow work of detectives who refused to let a life remain a mere footnote. Margaret told us once, with a steadiness that could break a heart, "I won't stop. I can't stop. He was my brother. We never forgot him." In those words is an instruction to remember, to inquire, and to ask the world to be kinder in its answers. If you remember anything, no matter how small, reach out. Because sometimes the smallest detail becomes the last piece of the puzzle. And sometimes the truth, like a phoenix, re-emerges when enough people search the ashes. If you're touched by this story, please subscribe to our channel